So, thank you all for coming. This is the Drupal and Salesforce, a fresh look talk. This is just really meant to focus on kind of like what you can do with Drupal and Salesforce today with what's readily available. I know that for some of you that have looked at those types of interactions or integrating those two systems before, there's been a lot that has evolved over the years, and so I just want to give a fresh look at it. Before that, just want to say thank you all for coming to Texas Camp. This is, I think, the smallest one yet, but we're here, and that's all that matters, right? So about me, my name is David Porter. I'm a principal engineer at Rackspace, and this is just some of my you can find me online as Big Happy Face on GitHub, Drupal.org. I have a little over 8 years developer experience. I'm a Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 certified developer, and I have a little over 2 years Salesforce dev experience, although I've been working with it for the better part of a decade. But in the last 2 years, I've been really focusing on it, especially development within the Salesforce platform. So for this talk, I'm just going to kind of go over a quick recap for those of you that may not be familiar with Salesforce, or if you just want to kind of talk a little bit more about what it can do. Spent a little bit of time on the Salesforce APIs that make not only Salesforce run, but power the entire integration capabilities, which is pretty powerful stuff. After that, I'll go over the Salesforce Suite, kind of talk about the different modules, what they do, and ideas of different versions, etc. After that, I'll go over something called object and entity mapping, which is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of coordinating between the two platforms, as well as the push and pull model for the synchronization behaviors, right? Not just what to sync, but when and how. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the additional suite modules, especially in different versions that are out there, kind of give you an idea of what's up. And then there should be some time for questions, but I don't know about minutes. However, don't wait for me to go to the last slide for questions. If you guys want to talk about questions, go for it. I insist. I'd rather talk about things in context than make you wait till the end. Is that fair? So, first, we'll go with the Salesforce recap. So what is Salesforce? It is a customer relationship management solution that brings companies and customers together. It is an integrated platform so that it does include things like marketing, sales, commerce, service, and it is meant to be, in a lot of ways, a business automation and management platform, even beyond the CRM. Most of the companies that rely on Salesforce will leverage it extensively, although perhaps maybe not for things like HR, right? Or internal business operations, but it's not uncommon for businesses to be like all in on Salesforce, right? Especially considering the amount of money that it costs, right? Like, it's not cheap, let's use it. So yeah, it is a CRM, that's the bread and butter, and if you buy the cheapest possible version, that's what you get, is just like the core CRM functionality. It is a software as a service platform, which means that Salesforce maintains it and hosts it for you, and so you don't install it on premises or anything like that. It is something that is very tightly controlled, and they want to make sure that it delivers the type of service level agreements and the other things that you need to run your business. It does use license-based pricing, so things can get like really hairy really fast depending on what you're talking about buying, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. It does offer a comprehensive custom development platform. So if you guys haven't used any of it, the entire platform is written in a language called Apex, which is basically Java or C++, whichever one you're more familiar with. But it's an object-oriented language that does have some really unique facilities that are specific to Salesforce, as well as all the things built into it to limit, based on the limits of the software as a service platform. Like for instance, if you can't process 10 billion records, they won't let you do that because you'll bog everybody else down. So their custom development platform has built in the limits so that you can only process so many records without affecting your neighbors, if you will. As of 2 or 3 years ago, they implemented something called the Lightning platform, which is a complete overhaul of the user interface and the means by which developing not only user interface but custom applications in Salesforce, and that's the Lightning platform. It's not just Apex and weird HTML. It is standard HTML, JavaScript, CSS, very portable stuff, and so it would make sense for. There's a good transition, especially for Drupal developers, because of the common languages and the common frameworks. And about 2 years ago, they released something called Salesforce DX, which is the developer experience, where they took it many steps further, not only with things like Lightning, but actually introducing a very rational means of version control, which we're all very comfortable with. But, well, unfortunately, the truth is, in the Salesforce world, it's very uncommon to run into folks with version control for their Salesforce instance. It's complicated. There's a lot of components, storing everything versus only certain things. There's a lot to it, and most people just don't even mess with it. Lastly, Salesforce is the result of a very comprehensive set of APIs, right? Most of it is in the core area, but there are a bunch of other additional APIs for things that they acquire typically. That's kind of the big one. They acquire a new product or service, they add a new API instead of maybe integrating it, but at least they're all kind of consistent. So that's actually a good segue into the different APIs. So the API's been around for quite a long time, which is why it's available in SOAP. But they do have a REST option now, which is what I would recommend. It makes sense, and we use it for so many different things now, right? That's the way I would go. The APIs are updated 3 times annually. There's the spring, summer, and winter releases, and so they usually increment the API version every one of those releases. It is an OAuth 2.0 protocol-based authentication, which is, again, nothing uncommon to our web development world, and so it fits right in. There is an overwhelming amount of documentation explaining every single operation, every single endpoint, how you could use it, where you would use it, and what the limits are. I mean, it's all there, better than most platforms. Most of the things come from the Force.com API, which is like the core API for talking to the CRM and talking to different data and objects within the platform. And that's not something they acquired, that's something they're building, so it fits in, right? But there's another very common one, the bulk API, and that's where operating on huge volumes of records. And not only is it because of limits in terms of the number of records that you can process to alleviate strain on the platform, but a lot of people have a lot of automation in Salesforce, validation rules, all kinds of custom code that looks at stuff whenever it's getting created or updated. So the bulk API helps make sure that you can operate in that manner and have those constraints without taking the system down. And it's not uncommon for people to be in that situation. Where I work, we have so many different things installed and so much custom code around a lead object because we're very sales heavy that it's just crazy. And it's not uncommon for people to want to load 2,000, 3,000 new leads from let's say a lead buy, right? We have to use the bulk API because if we load them in through the front door, it'll take the system down, or it'll just crash real hard, or everybody will start complaining that things are running slow. So this is the reason why they built the bulk API for those kinds of needs. And there are many others. One's focused on analytics. One's focused on metadata, which is kind of the term for how things are stored, configuration, code, etc. inside of Salesforce. There's the Apex API for just running arbitrary code and getting information about it, etc. There's a lot of there are many others. Just to kind of give you an example too of what's available to Salesforce, to Drupal when you are authenticated. Let me pull this up a little bit. Here you see that by authenticating, I have access to all of these different endpoints and all this capability. So, you've got the basic tooling, metadata as I described, but now you can get into modifying tabs, doing searches, Internet of Things. Wave is analytics, right? Fingerprint services, anything you want. Queries for data, jobs, whatever you want. It's all there. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right, of what you can do. So it's a good segue for me to talk a little bit more about the suite itself. So it is one module with many other modules, pretty common in the Drupal world. It's currently for version 8 is the 3.4 stable release. That's what I use. That's what I recommend. There is a 4.0 version in beta that is largely centered around authentication, storing credentials and all that. Right now, they're just kind of using storing credentials in config, right, which could be visible. Unfortunately, there's a way to get around that without exposing them, but they use a much more robust system in version 4 that they're trying to get out to stable. There is a version for 7, right? I don't think it's maintained though anymore. I don't think they've seen a release since like 2016. If you're using 7, don't right, upgrade, please. There are UI-based configurations, so you can go in without having to do any code, just clicks and be able to configure advanced mappings or integrations, right? Do the authentication, etc., without having to write code. But the module does come with the coding facilities to allow you to do custom solutions. Namely, it gives you direct access to the REST client, and if you're running it in a bootstrapped context, it will already be authenticated, so you can just write custom code and without having to worry about all the scaffolding of like authenticate, do all this. You can just write your code as you wish. Here's an example of what I'm talking about there. Now, you don't want to have to dive into code, right? I mean, just to run this thing, and you don't. But you do have the ability to do, like, for instance, refer to custom Apex, grab the client, right, out of our container, and then perform an API call. And notice that this is path, API call path. That can be any of these, because they all use like the same client. If you're just always referring to a different path and you're just passing it different data, so it's extremely simple to write custom versions of code, right? And so that they give you an example of what that looks like here. In this case, they're calling this endpoint right here. It's like Apex that has a custom REST endpoint that just pass data in as an example. Again, it comes with lots of modules, right? So the main one, the Salesforce integration one, or just Salesforce, it handles everything right now. It does auth, it does all of your global settings, gets the client wired up, all the good stuff. Everything else is optional. The mappings are optional, and mappings is really the core functionality there. There's a UI counterpart for mappings that just gives you the actual user interface to build those mappings if you don't want to define them via software, or if you define them like in a staging environment and then you push those configs to production, but you don't want to allow people to do modifications. A normal pattern in Drupal. There's the push and the pull modules for if you want that functionality to push entity data into Salesforce. Then conversely, there's pull to actually extract it back out. There's the logger, which I think pretty much speaks for itself. Then there's the SOAP, the SOAP approach. And I think that's just there from legacy perspective. I can't actually imagine a reason why somebody would want to use it, and I don't think that there's any functionality in the REST API that is only available in the SOAP API. Now, maybe you have some old code or whatever, but that's not Drupal, right? In the Drupal world, I can't imagine why you would use it. And then there's an example module. It's pretty cool. That's what I was showing you guys now. You can look in there for ideas of how to do custom code, but the problem with the example module is that if you turn it on, it will create some entities and it will try to do some mappings for you, but for the most part, hey, it doesn't offer that much value. It's a super modest example module. Okay, so before I go too much further, I have a Simply Test Me instance started. I have my own developer org in Salesforce booted up, and I've connected the two, and so I'm going to do some live interactions. I know it's pretty bold. That's like not what I'm supposed to be doing, right? But we're going to go. It was working okay for me right now, so we're going to go. And if it's messed up, I'm sorry. But I think you're going to find that it works pretty well. So first, again, the mapping is all about synchronizing what you call Salesforce objects, right? Which are just kind of like, just objects, things with fields in them, with Drupal entities, and they're so analogous that everything just kind of works out of the box. An example would be users. If you have lots of Salesforce users, let's say like a customer type of user, you could also synchronize that with a customer entity in Salesforce and move them back and forth. You can configure down to the field level, so only some fields are transferred between. And those you can use those fields to also govern the behavior of like always inserting new records, updating records, etc. You can configure the synchronization settings, which we'll take a look at. You can also configure the cron and the queue behaviors, how frequently you want it to go look for updates and to pull down data. And then there's also the queuing, which is kind of unique. There's not like a good way to visualize it, but basically, for every mapping, there's a queue of what's contained in that mapping. So if you've got 5 users that were synchronized, you can have a queue just for synchronizing those users, and it makes things a little bit. You can have like faster rules or longer rules. Only synchronize this queue once a day versus every 10 minutes for leads or whatever have you. It does track those mapped entities, and so you can always go back and look and see like what's actually tracked between the system, and then it provides links to go and look at them between the systems. I'll show you that in a moment. And then the mappings themselves are weighted, and that you can have one mapping at the top and versus one at the bottom, and that's the order in which it will execute, which can be helpful for sure, especially if you're doing things like let's say you created a user and you wanted to create 2 or 3 different objects, and they had to happen kind of in a sequence like that. That's where you would use weighted mappings, right? You would say, do this one, then this one, then this one, right? And it would follow the order you required. All right, so mappings. Under structure, we've got mappings. In this case, for the demonstration purposes, I created 2. One's called a contact mapping. I created a simple entity called contact. It's a content entity, which is probably not the best selection here, but it's easy because I can just go create it real quick in the system. For synchronizing these records back and forth. And then I created one for web form submissions, which we'll go over in a little bit. So for this mapping here, you can select your entity type in Drupal. You'll see there's a bunch: comments, contact messages, like terms, whatever you want, right? As long as it's an entity, you can synchronize it. And then in the case of a content entity, you can select the appropriate bundle, right? And same thing for say like a web form. It should give you options for the different forms there as opposed to the different content bundles, etc. You can pick the object. That's in Salesforce to map to, and the nice thing is it reads all of the objects that are possibly available in Salesforce, and so there you go, anything you want, including custom objects, which is always very helpful. You can control the synchronization behavior, and so in this case, if I ever create any of these records in Drupal, I want to push them to, and if anything happens with them over in Salesforce, I want to pull it all in, including deletions. You can see how often and when was the last time that things were pulled in or pushed. You can see what field is used for the trigger. I mean, this is all customizable. Actually, we'll go a little bit more over the pull settings and the push settings here in a little bit. And then here's the weight, where you can control the weight of it all. So that's the basic settings. Here's an example of fields. So in this case, I know that I'm going to use email as the upsert key, as the unique identifier. I don't want to store... You've got like your Drupal ID, you've got your Salesforce contact ID, and like reconciling those can be a little funny. So if you can use something like email, it's better. And here you can choose the different properties of the contact bundle and map it to another one. In this case, they're like literally the same exact name, but I only have a few items here in the entity. But as you can see for Salesforce, in the contact object, I got all kinds of goodies, right? Like we can, anything we want. You can also control the direction if you just want to have one way or bilateral. And that's just an example of it. You can just keep adding to them. There is a CSS bug here. I don't know if you saw it, but we got a little bleed here going. So in this case, I've got contacts inside of Salesforce, I've got contacts inside of Drupal, and they're synchronized. So let's look at a little bit more of what that looks like in action. In my Salesforce instance, I've got tons of contacts. Because I had configured this earlier, I took the opportunity to go ahead and synchronize all contacts, and you'll see here that I've got all these different contacts now. Edna, Jack, all these like stub contacts that come in. We can create one here and synchronize it up. We can make changes up on the Salesforce side. Let's try that one real quick. Andy Young. A. Young. Dickinson, okay. Let's try that. Andy Young. There he is. Let's try something along the lines of, let's change his last name. How about that? To Andy Youngest. On this side, it hasn't synchronized yet, but you'll see that when I refer to it in Salesforce, it knows which record we're talking about here. And I can always just click that link to go open it directly. Now, granted, I already had it open. Now, because it uses cron for synchronization, we'll go do that real quick. All right. Andy Youngest. And so that's an example of running cron to pull stuff down. Granted, these are very simple examples. You can do things that are far more complicated, but that's just basic entity migration there. Let's also go do one more change. Let's actually change it here. Let's try adding. Okay. Bullet, yeah. Let's go run cron real quick. Oh, I have, let's go see. Let's go look what the logger says. All kinds of updates in here. So it's performing updates. I'll have to dig into the other one. But that's an example of that kind of mapping. And so there's, let me get back here. There's examples there of the tracked entities, the weighted stuff. Any questions on entity mapping so far? Any use cases? Any wild ideas? No? I guess this is a good time to ask. Do you guys use Salesforce? Like, yeah? Yeah? How about you guys? Not really? Oh, okay, cool. Well, then, what do you guys think so far?
Yeah. So we do have an integration between our website, a Drupal 8 website, and Salesforce. We're using web forms as well. I didn't actually even know that there was a whole module dedicated to just Salesforce. So we're using, I think it's like web form 2 leads or something like that.
Yeah, Salesforce really web delete.
Really simple, just pushes leads from web form submission into Salesforce. And then we do custom Salesforce instance to sync to other applications.
Gotcha, okay. Oh, yeah, then, so I'm very familiar with that module you're talking about, and I can tell you that this gives you head and shoulders so much more functionality.
No, yeah. The functionality out of this, and there's like 2 screens in the other one.
Yeah. It's just a weird little mapping thing, and then you don't get any kind of like feedback of what actually occurred because it just fires and forgets into a queue-based web delete post queue. Yeah, that thing's crazy. So just the mapping alone is pretty powerful, especially because you can do compound things, right? Like let me give you an example. I can have multiple mappings for any entity. So in this case, I can have multiples, right? Like exactly which one of like set web forms, right? Like I can pick which form I'm using, but I could actually have 2 or 3 mappings for the same form. So if you submit a form, let's say I wanted to have it create a lead, but let's say that if under certain conditions, I wanted it to create a campaign member, I could do that. I could have both objects created instantly, right? Under those conditions, and I could do it with all the clicks.
What about not creating a lead based on certain like drop-down values on the web form?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I haven't gotten that far, but I would think that would be doable. I haven't run into that one yet. Yeah, the not create.
Yeah, we ended up creating 2 versions of the same form. One that submits based on the value, submits it to Salesforce, and the other one just sends an email and stores it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't run into that one, and I can only say that only because we've been using this module for a little while. Otherwise, we've been using the same one. Mm-hmm. But it's not often that I get into a situation where they say, don't create the lead.
That's
right?
A general contact form, and they have like 4 options for why you're contacting, and one
sure.
is new business inquiry. Those they want to push to Salesforce.
Somewhere else.
The other ones they want to just distribute from the office. So.
Yeah, see now that would be neat. Some kind of conditional mapping. Yeah, I like it. We'll chat more about that later. So that's really it in terms of what you can do with mappings. It is pretty straightforward. It doesn't have a lot of logical facilities, but that's something I think that makes a lot of sense. Next, we'll talk a little bit more about that push-pull model. It can be a combination of CRUD based and cron based, and so for instance, if you submit a lead or a form, you want it to create the lead automatically. You don't want to stick it in a queue, so that would be CRUD based. And then there's the cron based, which is mostly for polls, because simply put, Salesforce doesn't have like an endpoint to call for Drupal. It's not built to on demand invoke things like a remote procedure call or something. And so that's why the cron side of things. It is queue driven, and that's really the support cron is just to stick things in an area and run it later. You can have the multiple mappings with special conditions, and so where you cannot necessarily control when a mapping is invoked, you can control a couple of things. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we want to only affect certain leads. That's where this SOQL where clause comes in. So you guys are familiar with SQL. There's something called SOQL, which is the same thing except it's object query language. So it's almost identical to SQL except you're talking about objects, and so relationships are different. You don't have joins and stuff like that. You use object relationships. We can talk about that later. But the idea is that you can then filter out records. So I'm only going to pull down ones of certain criteria, and you can enumerate that on any, not just field, but you can also use the relationship notation to be like, if I only want to synchronize ones where the owner of the ID is this person, or if it's not of this person, or whatever have you. You can be real specific, which will be helpful, especially if you've got like a real large installation. Like imagine like partners, right? If you've got like partners in your website, it's more like a partner portal. It would only bring in their leads and stuff like that. You can set up the frequency here, and so that's one of the cool things is that on a per mapping basis, you can say only pull these things in, only pull in every hour or as often as possible. Whether or not you want a standalone queue, or if you want to like use just a giant queue, which could get weird, right? Potentially. The same thing for push. You can disable a real-time push and go to a cron-based push, and then different settings. There is retries, which is interesting. I always found retries to be pretty pointless. Like if it didn't make it the first time, how is it going to make it again next time? Like there was a reason it didn't make it.
Limits in Salesforce.
Yeah, now that could be an example. Yeah, if just in the last push it did run into limits. It's a good point. But yeah, for the most part though, I have found that retries generally in programming are like weird, right? Like just try it again. It'll happen this time, right? Like going and pulling $1 million out of the bank, right? Like this time it's going to work. You know? So that's really it for the push-pull model. I mean, you know, push stuff when it's available, pull it in when you can. You know, that's of course that is limiting if you don't use a cron. If you don't use cron in Drupal, but that's not that common. So it tends to fit in pretty well. Let's see here. Let's go look around a little bit more. So we have these individual push-pull settings. That's at the individual mapping level. There are other Salesforce settings that you can do. Your global push limit for queues, maximum sizes, so you can end up in situations where you're not like getting too overloaded. This mapped revisions is interesting. If you've got constant revisions coming down, you're synchronizing data, right? How many revisions will you actually go for? There are hidden objects. There is metadata where you can hide things. That's what this would do here. Is this would like use the API to expose everything to you and not just read-only type things. Or things that are typically only accessible for that user. So there's lots of neat settings in here, but for the most part, once the systems are connected, it really comes down to the mappings and/or any custom code that you're doing. Let's see here. Next. Additional suite modules. So we had gone over the ones that were available up here, right? But there are a couple we didn't really describe. First is the Salesforce web form module that does provide the integrations for web forms, which I'll go back and show you right now in a moment. I think it's awesome. I mean, when it comes down to just like create this, ship it off there, I mean, it couldn't be any easier. There is also in the new version of the module, I've mentioned that they are improving their authentication. So there's two that are available there now. One is the JWT, which stands for JSON Web Token, which is an alternative means of authenticating and then storing a token and just using that for interactions. It's a lot safer than storing the credentials. Then they have like a legacy OAuth user agent flow, which is like basically using the credentials for every time it talks to Salesforce. Now, that doesn't always have to happen. Depending on how you build it, you can have like a token that gives you a refresh. You can refresh off of the token and get a new token instead of having to submit the credentials every single time. But they do have that support there. For some reason, you want to use that. But the web form stuff is what's really nice, and it's built in. It comes with the suite, so it's not like you have to do anything other than turn it on. And so let's go take a quick look at that. All right, so I created a very basic lead form. First name, last name, company, email, message, right? Like pretty much the basics of what you need to create a lead. Let's go look also at the mapping. In this case, web form submission entity type, the lead form. I want to push it to the lead object, but I'm only going to do creates, right? Like just push it. If I don't, we don't need to update leads. I'm not going to store them. They're not like a special record type. It's just it's a form submission, which happens to be an entity, and that's all I'm doing in this case. Nothing special. Now the fields are one-to-one. Again, first name, last name, company, right? Here you'll notice directions are a little bit different because I don't have pull and push. I can't control that behavior. It's only going to Salesforce. So pretty straightforward combination there. Let me go pull this up here in leads. See, I've created a couple of tests, but in this case I'll use web forms little test facility, which just pumps a bunch of garbage in here. Submit. Boom. Bam. There it is. Pretty much instant. And again, this is unidirectional, right? But that's nice, right? And you can go back and make the alters, and then you can always go back and know, even though it's not maintaining, it's not synchronizing data coming back in for that lead, you can go back into the web form submission itself. And let's see here. That was back to the form itself. Now, I don't think that they have a button for Salesforce here, but it's kind of weird. They kind of located under content. Under content is the Salesforce tab, and it's all of their mapped objects, and you'll see that here is the most recent, right? The submission number 5. Here's the Salesforce ID that I would be looking at, and you can go back in here and compare that. That's the ID, and so at least you can always go back and look at it, and that's a nice, useful record versus what you're talking about today with web delete. You just fire and forget, and if there's a problem, if you don't have debug emailing turned on, you'll never know, ever. Right? So, as you can see from a form perspective, it's just like it's a night and day, and it's immediate, right? It's not asynchronous at all, so you'll know if there's an issue. So that's really it in terms of the additional modules, and really kind of the big view of it all. We are about 20 minutes ahead of time, which is what I was hoping for, because it is almost the end of the day. So, questions? Oh, okay. On that note, thanks again for coming to Texas Camp and listening to my spiel. This was a lot of fun. I actually submitted this like an hour before the end of the CFP, under pressure from other people, because there were actually fewer submissions than there were slots, going like an hour into the end. And so, like, pretty much everybody that submitted got a talk. It's kind of fun. But otherwise, that's that. I have some listing for sources of what of information in here, but that's really about it. You guys going to the after party? That was my question. Yeah, that'll be fun. You going to the after party? I'm sorry, where?
What actually is it?
I just know that it's happening, and it's supposed to be at a pretty cool place.
The luxury, whatever that is.
Yeah, that's right, the luxury.
Yeah, it's like an outdoor bar area. It's nice.
Outdoor
They have
bar.
really good fries. They're called cracker fries.
Cracker fries. All right.
So, questions?
So, yeah, I told you that Texas Tribune, which is a nonprofit news organization like we are, is the way that they populate their, on the website, disclosures about all of the people who have donated to them is, and their website is mostly Django. They pull it in daily from Salesforce.
Gotcha.
So I was up there talking to them about that, and they said yes, they would be very happy to help me out with that. When I talked to them, obviously this is different because it's being pulling into Drupal 8 site. But what do I need to ask them about how to pull that?
Do you show a list on the website now from a to be transparent, you provide a publicly accessible list of donors.
Right, and it's perennially out of date because it's manually updated.
It's manually updated. Is it just like a basic piece of content in Drupal, and you just go and edit the node? And
It has been a list.
It has been a list.
Inside of a piece of content. What the cool thing about Texas Tribunes is that you can search by year. You can search by the size of donations.
Sure.
And obviously, like I've got people who are contributing $10 a month. This thing would be updating. Texas Tribs is updating those kinds of people to their whatever level they're at.
Absolutely.
Right? So you could search by name. You could search by, it's in a table. It becomes a database. Right?
So to be like super, granted, I need to look a little bit deeper into it, but high level. You would go in here, you would install this on your site. You would want to establish a piece of content, a bundle of some kind, content type, and you would say, like, call it donor, right? And you would add all the applicable fields, right? Name, amount, I don't know, last time donated or whatever have you. Then you would go and configure the mapping. Now, I don't know if Texas Tribune has a custom object called donor that they created, right? Which would be cool, or if it's like contact,
Right.
if it's a contact type. But that's actually comes back down to the mappings, right? So in this case, I'm synchronizing a contact, right? But in Salesforce, there's something called a record type,
Right.
right? So you can have a general contact, but you could have a donor contact, a friend contact, and they're just different identifiers, right? Same concept. So in this case, you would configure the mapping, and then in the pull, that's where you would say like, oh, record type ID equals, whatever it is, right? And then you could focus in the synchronization of only pulling in those donors. And then that's also the other thing I would do is that, you could do like a pull only, right? So then what's happening is every time cron runs, you're pulling in the latest version of the donors. Then you create a view that lists out your donors, right? And then you could add your, what is it, like exposed filters? And that's where you could be like donated year, donated amount, name, state, whatever, right? And so it'd be pretty straightforward how to pull this off, right? I think the hardest part would be making sure you've got the right content entity. That's kind of, you got your fields and all the map, you kind of got that worked out in advance, and then you've got your view created. And the nice thing is, you should be able to build everything in Drupal and have it like done, right? Like manually, you just manually update it, right? And get everything in there. You know it looks correct. You know you've got the right fields. Then you configure the mapping, and it just starts filling your content in for you, right? So there's not really like a mutual dependency between the two, right? You could just kind of set one up, and then having a list like that would be super clean. And then you could put like pagination. You could have it filter where only synchronize donors in the last 5 years. Right? Only show, or you can do all kinds of good stuff, right? So, and then it would be all contained there. So I mean, that's just going to be a real basic data integration. So there you go. That's how I would knock that out. Leveraging record types too would be cool because it not only would the filter, this query here, be super simple, but that's what the record types are for. That's what they're built for, right? And that way you're not building whole custom objects of the exact same fields, right? Instead, you just get a permutation of it. And then the cool thing is with record types, you can also set up like other things, other limits, like the different values from pick lists, different views of how you look at it, who accesses it, stuff like that, right? You can also do lead assignment, like you do like routing, but that's if you're pushing. That's if you're pushing data though, so that's a different discussion. But that's how I would knock that one out, and I don't think that it would be too. You'd be speaking like really basic Drupal and basic Salesforce, right? Which is like helpful, right?
And just one of the other things that would happen with that data once it's on there in a searchable form and is that every time we do an article, a news article, we can also search that database and put a disclosure at the bottom of the news article that says so-and-so was mentioned.
Good point.
In the news article.
Cross-referenceable.
That's critical to my credibility.
Yeah, in the system.
To disclose that.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And having that data, that synchronization, that automation, yeah, you could basically build it all, and then it would just kind of continue to be up to date and accurate, and you can go on about your life, right? The dream.
And be up to date and be
Yeah.
accurate with everything.
Yeah.
Without a huge amount of manual intervention.
Well, that's got to be frustrating too. It's like, I'll get it to you later. I'm gonna need that list, please. Well, here's the thing. Yeah. No, it would be nice to not have that, and then you could even have another view that just straight up exports as like CSV if you wanted to have it as distributable. Right.
Right, and that is an important thing too. I mean, like there are folks who want a list of who are your top 10 donors or whatever. Salesforce is really good.
Now, as far as so if you were interacting with them, that's another cool thing about this is that it would give you a path for pulling their data in, but you don't really spend any time in their Salesforce, right?
I try not to, but
yeah.
It's kind of frightening.
You could get further away from having to do that, right? Which would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I have interns who do that. And by the way, speaking of price for nonprofits, the only reason we can afford it is because Salesforce gives it to us for free.
They give it to you for free, and so take advantage of that. You asked about what you would need to ask for them. Since we got a little bit more time, I might as well surface some of this stuff to you. The way you're going to authenticate is inside of Salesforce. You'll have to create something called a connected app. So if you're a user you've got credentials, username, password, right? But if you want to actually connect as an application in an automated way, you have to create OAuth authentication token, right? And so in this case, what I did was I created a connected app called Drupal, and like creating a connected app couldn't be easier. It takes 2 fields, okay, the name and that's it, right? Like name and contact email. Where it gets a little tricky is configuring OAuth, but it's not too bad. Here's why. They know you're going to have to create this, so they give you the number one complicated thing is they give you this callback URL. They print it there for you, so you literally just copy that and paste it in this callback URL box. Boom, done. And then after that, the only key thing here is that you would is this like the permissions of the app, API permissions, and make sure that it has this refresh token. That's like the key. Without the refresh token, it doesn't work. It needs to be able to stay connected. Otherwise, what will happen is you'll get it connected, and then an hour later, it won't be connected, and then you'll be like, why is my system not working, right? So with those 2 things, bam, that's it. You fire it off, and there you go. And then it'll give you a key, like a secret in key. Then you'll type those into, actually, right there. This is all going to go away anyway, so no big deal. But you'll put those values here, and then you'll hit save configuration. What will happen is it will then use OAuth authentication to send you to Salesforce, and then you'll have to like allow the application. But there's a problem with that. It's under your credentials. So everything that happens moving forward would be Charlotte. It would say Charlotte did this, Charlotte pulled this guy in, Charlotte updated that, right? Which is okay. But what I would really recommend would be a service user. You ask them for a very simple API-only user, and that basically what you would do is, you would log in as that user in advance. You would then go in here, do the authentication, and then because you're already logged in as that service user, it would just like, oh, allow this. You would hit allow, connections made, you're good to go. That way it's obvious what's going on. Like I did this for a group called at Rackspace called the Process Engineering Group, the PEG group, and all they do is write like all kinds of cool automation. And so I created a process engineering group for them, right? That's the user, right? And it's API only, and they can use this. They have this OAuth. They have their own app, and that's it. And everything that happens, it says process engineering group did this, and which is really nice because everybody knows who to go talk to. But it's not like, Dave, why did you update this lead? Oh, I didn't, right? Dave, you're doing a lot in Salesforce these days, right? Like, that's weird stuff. But that will be the, I'm glad we got to talk about the authentication stuff because that is like the overwhelming hurdle. Once you get that connected and you know you've got the right token so it doesn't expire, after that, it's just mapping. Any big ideas? You ready to go? Awesome. I think I hope that you were able to get a lot of that going. That would be a neat thing to talk about. See it in the wild.
Well, I mean, and the bottom line of all of this is that now more than ever, news organizations have to show in every article, in every way they possibly can, transparency and credibility.
Yeah.
So that's what's underneath it.
It's a tough business to be in, right? Especially because it's like you're under the gun for credibility because of other people's lack of credibility. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like guilt by association kind of a thing. Yes.
Yeah, but it's important.
Back to the question about not creating a lead based on a value. Could you do like an apex trigger on insert and check for a certain value coming in?
Absolutely.
And just handle it there?
Absolutely. Could do it as a trigger. You could do it as trigger would probably be the most efficient, right? But it is custom code. You could probably pull it off with some like a validation rule, right? You could also pull it off with like kind of like maybe some custom coding on this to actually like that would be I think a perfect patch scenario right, would just be like some kind of conditional exclusion, and that way just tell Drupal to just drop it, right? You know, something along those lines. That's like what they really need here is they've got the filter for pulling. They don't have a filter for pushing, right? So my recommendation would be to stop. It wouldn't be to do it as a trigger. If you're gonna write custom code, get Drupal to not do things, right? As opposed to like stopping Drupal from doing it, right? That would be my recommendation, and I can almost guarantee you they'll take it. They'll move real fast on it.
Okay.
And I'm always down for code review, so hit me up. Code review is always always helpful, right?
Yeah.
Always helpful. But yeah, I could see where that would be helpful, especially like with one form and all that. You just want to be able to.
Yeah, the website it's headless and it's built in React, and so the form on the back end is built in the web forms model.
I got you,
So
but
you
it's a.
switch out the form targeted form ID based on the drop down.
Gotcha.
And so one submits to Salesforce, one doesn't.
So what form's really more of just like post control?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, that's cool. That's a neat way to do it. Nice. All right. Well, guys, let's get out of here. It's almost that time.